Hello and welcome to the Curator's Corner. Here at the Curator's Corner, we aim to bring you the history of firefighting in Philadelphia, as well as the history of the Philadelphia Fire Department and its volunteer partners. On this episode of the Curator's Corner, we're going to talk with retired Deputy Chief Robert J. Marchisello and learn more about his book, A Firefighter's Journal. Hello, and welcome back. I'm your host, Firefighter Brian Anderson, Curator of Fireman's Hall Museum. Joining me today is retired Deputy Chief Robert J. Marchisello. Chief, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Brian.
Chief, could you just go into telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I was a fire buff since I was 2 years old. And after meandering through a few other careers, I joined the fire department in 1973, retired in 2010. And since then, I've been with Delaware County as a hazardous materials specialist.
What was it that fascinated you about being a fire buff? What were you into, the pictures or just the screaming of the apparatus going down the street? What keyed you into being a fire buff? And did that have influence on you becoming a Philadelphia firefighter?
It was a little bit of everything. As I described in my book, the house that we lived in when I was a kid, we had a third floor flat. And it was on Reed Street. And ladder 11, which was at 12th below Reed, or above Reed, would constantly go by my window. And as a 2-year-old, I was fascinated by these men in the tin helmets and canvas coats running by. And I just really would run. I would drop whatever I'm doing and run to the window to watch them go by. And then one night, the factory across the street from my house caught fire. And I got to see the firefighters in action. And I was just amazed by the coordination, the bravery, the efficiency, and how the neighbors were all pleased when they put the fire out and saved the neighborhood factory in which a lot of people worked in.
For our viewers, could you give us a little content of the year that you came on the department and what the culture was like at that time, just so we can kind of put in context your time in service?
I came in 1973 after spending a year in the Philadelphia Fire Reserve, or the Reserve Fire Force. And the culture was the He-Man culture. No air packs. I mean, if you opted to wear an air pack on your own, which there was only one in each company, it was considered a sign of not being able to hack it or take it as you're putting the fire out. And when I later went to an engine company, I was the tip man, and the tip man, or the nozzle person, whatever you want to call it, was not assigned the air pack. The one pack in the company went to the backup man that backed up the tip man. And I had a senior veteran, and I love this guy, John Buggy. And he told me when I first got there, he says, if you ever have to give up the tip, you'll only give it to me. He said, but you better never have to give that tip up. So that was kind of like the culture. It was all about the macho aspect of it. Another firefighter that broke me in was, I call him Uncle Frank. His name was Frank Castellucci. He was in engine 60 and I was in ladder 19. And Frank pretty much taught me about the thinking aspect of the job. And he said, what's the best tool you have on that truck? And I would sit there and think, what, the 35-foot ladder, the 6-foot hook, whatever. He says, no, it's right here. It's between your ears. That's the best tool you have in that truck. Use it. He said, don't just react, think. And that kind of, between that and some of the Shanghai firefighters we had there who taught me the macho aspect of it, I think I had a good foundation on which to base the rest of my career.
So coming out of the academy, you got assigned to what company first?
Ladder 19.
And you were at Ladder 19 for how long? Or
About about a year and a half. Ladder 19 at the time was a middle of the road company. There was no Ladder 32 in service at the time. We were in the peak of the war years. We weren't doing what they were doing in West Philly or North Philly, but we pretty much got our share. But Uncle Frank always said to me, he says, "You're only half of a fireman until you go to an engine company." And I put transfer into 45s, 68s, and 24s. And I got 24s when they put the D platoon into service in
right.
January 175.
Okay. And how long had you been assigned to 24s before you started thinking about taking that next step going into management?
About getting promotion or what?
Yeah.
Well, at 24s, we had the senior faction, and my mentor was John Buggy there, and some of the senior guys. But the middle of the road guys and some of us in the bottom were always studying. In the beginning, we were just studying to know our job. We were always in the books. We did everything from the training manual, the OPs, the directives. We even memorized all the box alarm numbers in our first alarm district so we could get a jump on the other companies. But somehow, us at the lower end, and we had a good Lieutenant Richie Sharp, we kind of said, "You guys are already halfway there. Keep studying and apply yourself and go for promotion." And that's what we did. We studied together in the firehouse, and it translated into study groups. And eventually, I did a lot of studying on my own. And I went to community college where I met a bunch of other firefighters who were doing the same thing.
So when you obviously you're reviewing different things to prepare yourself for the promotional exam. Now you get promoted. What was that transition like, moving from firefighter to lieutenant?
It was horrible. I wanted to quit. After 24s, I had spent a year at Engine 10. And when I got promoted, I only had 4.5 years on the job. And 3 of them in South Philly companies, which there wasn't a lot of things going on other than fighting fires in South Philly. Well, they sent me to Engine 43. And if you know anything about the fire department, you know Engine 43 is the toughest place for an officer to work. And those first 2 night shifts there, I must have said to myself 10 times, what the heck was I studying for? Because it was killing me. I was backed up with fire reports. I couldn't type. Backed up with fire reports, incidents that required things that I had never thought of. We had people living upstairs in the firehouse. We had the medic unit getting in accidents. We had all kinds of stuff that really gave the officer a bad day. And in my case, 2 bad nights. And I eventually, when we went to the officer development program, talked to some of my peers. And it seems like I wasn't the only one that was having a tough time with the transition. So that made me feel a little bit better. And I just resolved myself to get the 43s and try and make the best of it, learn whatever I can.
Well, I guess being assigned to 43s with all the different events that would come down the pike, it made you a well-rounded officer with a variety of different obstacles you'd have to deal with, from personnel to the amount of runs and the activities that happen at the station, I guess you would say, right?
Yeah, I mean, I went from row house fires to high rises, sub basements, and all of that stuff. Plus, we were a squirt company, which is something I never worked. And during the war years, the squirts there was only 2 squirts at the time. We were going all over. I'd say of all the city's extras, 43 was probably on 70% of them. And, it was challenging to overcome all those. But I do think that start gave me a good foundation for being an officer. And Rizzo had told his aide to tell me, he said that, tell him that if he could work at 43s, he could eventually work anywhere. So it was kind of like Rizzo that put me there, knowing exactly what he was doing to get me in all this. lack of trouble or close to getting in trouble being there.
So where did you go after 43s as an officer?
43s, at the time I was going to college, I was studying engineering. And somehow the fire department found out about it. And I got called down to research and planning and given an ultimatum. Either I was going to be an alarm room shift supervisor or go upstairs to fire prevention or the fire marshal's office. I was a backup fire marshal. Or I could go to research and planning and do what my engineering career had trained me for. And I went there and I worked directly for Chief Richmond, became Commissioner Richmond. Jim Miller was the assistant chief. And I didn't like it. I didn't want to be there. But it was an eye-opener and really gave me a good background of what goes in headquarters. Because at the time, I remember seeing chiefs who would come down headquarters and be scared to death walking around headquarters. And here I was doing it every day. So just, going to headquarters for whatever was never an issue for me after that. And what got me out of there was in 1980, we had the layoffs. And I had gone from a project officer to assistant apparatus officer. And they asked me to write a job description. And I said, basically, as assistant apparatus officer, I take the apparatus count in the morning, period. And I knew my job was going. But Richmond had told me, he says, you're going. He said, so don't embellish your resume as much as what you're doing here, he says, because your job's pretty much eliminated. I was happy because from there I went back to Engine 24.
Now, moving forward from being a lieutenant into the captain's position, what was it like when you finally achieved the rank of captain?
When I made captain, I was pretty much working I worked two different companies in West Philly, Ladder 13 and Engine 41. And then they sent me to 49s. And I guess the hardest thing in the transition for me was to go from busier companies to a slower company. The management aspect, I mean, a captain, his job's very similar to a lieutenant as far as a shift supervisor, has the added responsibility of managing the station or a company, depending if it's a single house or double house. And the hardest thing for me was to go from companies who were working all the time to go to 49s, which wasn't working like it was. But I was lucky enough to have good people there. And my 3 years there went by fairly quick. And I was born and raised in South Philadelphia, so it was convenient for me also because my daughter was young at the time and I could drop her off at my mom's for babysitting and pick her up after shift.
Now, anybody or any of our viewers that know you personally, know you have strong roots in hazmat. What stirred that interest? How did hazmat become a big interest of yours?
I had always been interested in hazmat. When I went to community, there was actually two hazmat courses taught by who I used to refer to as the Grand Sensei, Harry Cusick. But I preferred to be with the fire side and the busier companies and doing all of that stuff. When I was captain of 49s, as you're probably aware of, or maybe the viewers aren't aware of, it was in the 1st Battalion. And captains of companies in the 1st Battalion had to be qualified to act as battalion chief. And since Battalion 1 was a hazmat chief, my chief, George Del Rossi, who was an excellent chief, whenever the opportunity arose, would send me over to 60s or Ladder 19 to get trained in the hazmat aspect of it. And then eventually brought me on as an acting battalion chief with that experience. So I didn't think much of it. And when I finally was getting transferred out of 49s, I was so elated that Chief Del Rossi pulled a few strings and got me engine 65, which is really where I wanted to go. And he said, and I just blurted out, I said, Chief, if you ever need anything from me, that's great. In the future, if you're ever looking for somebody to come back down to the hazmat, I would do it. And I'm thinking in the future, I meant in the future, when I wanted to slow it down. Well, here I was at 65s for about 4 months, and the phone rang, and it was Chief Del Rossi. And he said, "We've had an issue down there with the two officers, and you're gone." I said, "Where?" He said, "Engine 60." I said, "Really?" He went, "Yep. You and your friend Bobby Lombardo, who I'd worked with at 24s and a few other places." And I was shocked because I was enjoying it in West Philly. The good side is 65s closed a few months later, and I would have been, who knows where I would have wound up. But I remember that night when I was told I was going, I received a copy of Fire Engineering magazine, and there was a hazmat series in here, and I read about a chemical called tetrahydrofuran. And I said, you know what? I could get into this. So I went down there with a positive attitude of, I'm going to make the best of it, and hopefully I could make a difference.
So not only did you make the best of it, you were the nuts and bolts behind hazmat growing to the standard of which we know today. Can you talk a little bit about that and a lot of implementation that you've done behind the scenes?
Well, it wasn't only me. I mean, I had some good officers there at Engine 60 and Ladder 19. The top one that you probably heard of over and over again whenever you talk hazmat back in the old days is Tommy Bitto. And I used to bounce ideas off of Tommy Bitto. We had Jimmy McGarrigle was in Ladder 19. My partner, Bobby Lombardo, and a lot of other guys. And I realized after being there maybe a couple months that they were trained pretty well, and they were trained by the Fire Academy. But they really didn't have any depth of knowledge as far as why they did the things they did. They really didn't understand hazardous materials behavior. And I start training them in different. I had with the engineering, I had a chemistry background a little bit. And when I went to 60s, I became a chemistry major too, but that's a different story. So I start training them on what I felt they really needed to know to evaluate a hazardous material incident properly and make that the foundation of the hazmat incident, upon which you would build your decon, your suit selection, and everything else. And I would do training exercises on our shift. We would train every night when I was down there in the beginning. And after a while of doing it, I decided to put it all together in one course. Now, you remember retired Deputy Chief Gary Appleby was running the Fire Academy at the time, and he had an outreach program. And that outreach program encouraged fire department officers or members to put a course together and teach them at the Fire Academy. So I approached Appleby and talked to him about it, and he loved the idea. He said, sure. He said, put it together, work on it. And he says, you could deliver it up the Fire Academy. And I did. It was received well. And I came up with an idea is if I could do one, and I had good officers in each platoon, we could do 3 others, and then I would do another one in addition to that. So we called it the 5-tier program of hazardous materials response. And it was our own in-house training program. And in the beginning, we did those through the outreach. And then eventually it became a standalone program. The last one we did in 2009 or 2008 was a 4-week standalone program. And it covered everything, how to evaluate it. And I would have different officers come in for different modules. Whatever I felt their specialty was in that module, like Tommy Bitto was great with the suits and the PPE, and Franny Doherty and Matty Black were good with the decon stuff. And Jimmy McGarrigle and Tommy Glennon and his crew, they were good with plugging and patching. So we kind of like played on their strengths, and each one did a module. And we also, we trained all the squad companies when they came in the beginning on their hazmat side. So, but it was expensive. And I understand department, saw the cost factor, and now it's basically a lot cheaper to send them to Anniston to get a 1-week hazmat tech program.
Wow. So after your retirement, you decided to put out a book, which is the Firefighter's Journal. And
yes.
For our viewers watching, it's on sale here at Fireman's Office Museum, which can be, there you go, which you can see on our website or here in the store. Can you give us a little background about your book and what motivated that?
Yes. I guess a little nuts, but I really wanted to be a firefighter badly. And when I became a firefighter, I wanted to record everything. So when I first went to the academy, I started keeping a little diary, they called it at the time, and with the diary morphed into a journal. Whereas after or during every shift, I would write a little bit of something in there, the incidents that we had, especially some of the things that you wouldn't think firefighters do, that sort of thing. But I also diaried everything we did in training, and how I felt about things, some of the vivid things that we saw, some of the stuff that the people wouldn't think that we get involved with. I felt that people should know about this, because when they think of firefighters, what do they see? They see fellows standing there with a Dalmatian and shiny uniforms and clean and pressed uniforms, but the job is actually dirty and dangerous at times, and we get involved in a lot more things than fires. So after I retired, I started to take some of the better stories from my journal, and there was things in my journal I didn't want anybody to see. So I started to take them from my journals and type them in the computer. And my son was over, and I would let him read some of them. And he said to me, he said, "Dad, you ought to write a book." And I thought about it, because at that time I had written about 8 or 9 different stories. And I started thinking, what years, what gaps? And I decided to take on the project, which was really hard. It took me 5 years to write the book. I mean, I didn't have any writing experience whatsoever. So it took me a long time, 5 years. Every afternoon, I would sit down at the computer when I was home and just go through it and over and over and over again. But you asked me if I would ever write another book. The answer is no, because it was really hard.
Well, I've read your book, a big fan, a lot of good content, especially for new firefighters coming on, a lot of good information they could absorb that could help them to go further in their career. Unfortunately, we are running short of time. I wish I had more time to talk more in depth of your concept, but we will be talking later on this month on our membership meeting night, which will be a longer program, about an hour, with Chief Marchisello reviewing his book and a lot about his career in hazmat. So if you have the opportunity, please check our website for a link to join us on January 26th at 7 p.m. Chief, I want to thank you again for joining us today. And I would also like to thank you for tuning in and watching. If you'd like to see more content like this, please hit and like and subscribe button and leave a comment. Follow us on all our social media platforms, and also check out our Freedom from Fire, hosted by firefighter Camilla Bayete from the Philadelphia Fire Department's Fire Prevention and Code Division. So until next time, remember 365, 24/7, fire is everyone's fight.